It was supposed to be a fun night out for these four friends, but then a wrong-way crash leaves three of them dead. The man driving the wrong way was sent to prison. But now, more than 2 years after the fatal crash, another person could also be heading to prison, despite the victim's family not wanting this at all. I'm Elizabeth Millner for Law&Crime. Now, this case has so many layers, so let's break this down. It's December 2022. TikTok influencer Alexandra Doolin was riding in a car with her boyfriend Devin Perkins and their friends Ava Fellerman and Kyle Moser. Now, for some who were on TikTok at the time, they might have known Alexandra better by her username, Allie Spice. She had nearly 1 million followers and was a rising star on the app. Then on December 11th of that year, her life and her friends' lives were cut too short. At the time, Florida Highway Patrol said a gray Toyota was traveling the wrong way when it crashed head-on into the car driven by Allie's boyfriend, Devin. Now, the crash killed Allie, Ava, and Kyle. Devin received serious injuries, but survived, and a fourth person in a separate car was also injured in the crash. But by the time authorities arrived to the scene, the driver of the Toyota was nowhere to be found. He didn't stay to make sure anyone was okay. He didn't call 911, so you can imagine authorities were on the lookout for him. Now, at the time, they believed he ran into the woods after the crash. But for the families of Allie, Ava, and Kyle, they had a clear message for that driver. Turn yourself in. Now, investigators worked the crash for months and surprisingly didn't just arrest one person, but two. Thomas Petrie, the driver of the Toyota, was arrested 4 months after the fatal crash in April of 2023. But here's the thing, Devin Perkins, Allie's boyfriend, was also arrested. Now, you can imagine how startling that development was, especially given how close he was to obviously Allie, but also Kyle and Ava. So why was he arrested when another driver was going the completely wrong way? Because according to Florida State troopers, Devin was driving 100 miles per hour, allegedly under the influence. His blood test showed low level of THC, and his blood alcohol content was 0.028, which is below the 0.08 legal limit. Now, initially, both Thomas Petrie and Devin Perkins were held without bond, but then a Florida judge granted Devin a bond of $80,000, which arguably he was very lucky to get. But he had many people that were on his side, including the parents of his girlfriend and friends that were killed in the crash. Kyle Moser's mother, Teresa, said in court, "My son was Devin's very best friend, and he was in the car that night, and they're all good kids. And I just really feel like he's being charged with it's just too much. I mean, yes, he was speeding, but he would not do anything to put these 3 passengers through what happened. And I feel that if the other car wasn't on the wrong side of the road, this wouldn't have happened." Meanwhile, Allie's mother asked, "I would just like to ask the court for a bond for Devin. I would like him to not be charged. I know that's not my case, but I would at least like him to get out of jail." Thomas Petrie ultimately avoided going to trial in the case. Instead, he pleaded no contest to reckless driving with serious bodily injury, leaving the scene of a crash involving serious bodily injury, 3 counts of vehicular homicide, and leaving the scene of a crash with death. According to FHP, that fatal night, he was out at a bar, drove his pickup in the wrong direction for at least 8 miles, then crashed head-on into Devin's car. He was sentenced to 37 years in prison for his role. As for Devin, he rolled the dice and took the case to trial. According to the Daytona Beach News Journal, he turned down a plea deal that would have given him prison time of anywhere between 10 to 20 years. So his trial took place last September, and a jury took less than half an hour to reach their verdict: guilty. Devin's attorney pushed for a new trial after his conviction. During a hearing earlier this year, the defense said there was a mistake by Devin's former attorney that impacted the outcome. That being Devin's former lawyer's questioning of an EMT about the smell of marijuana from Devin that opened the door to previously inadmissible evidence about his marijuana use. But from the state side of things, they said their focus wasn't on marijuana, but it was that Devin was driving more than 100 miles per hour at the time of the crash. Now, a judge ruled not to grant Devin a new trial, meaning sentencing is next for him. And he faces a lot of time in prison if a judge decides to throw the book at him. A minimum of 30 years. For Allie's family, they say it's like losing a child all over again, placing the blame on Tom Petrie. In a letter to the judge, Allie's parents wrote in part, quote, "We have never blamed Devin for Alexandra's death or for the deaths of Kyle and Ava. Yes, he was speeding, but he was in his lane following the road when Petrie, drunk and driving on the wrong side of the highway for over 9 miles, slammed into him head on." Now, the state says they plan to leave the sentencing up to the courts. So on March 3rd, we'll soon learn if Devin is going to prison, and if so, for how long. So let's break this down with retired NYPD detective and co-host of the Gold Shield show. That's Tom Smith. Tom, always great to see you, and thank you so much for joining me. You know, this case is incredibly sad. 3 young people died in this 2022 crash. But what are your thoughts on this case overall?
Yeah, like you just said, it's a very odd case that you have three victims and two separate people being charged with their death. That is not the norm, and it just shows how integral cases can be when you get to a scene and you think it's one thing, and then all of a sudden you start doing an investigation and find out there's more to it. Talking about the actions and inabilities to drive a car correctly of the driver, but it's a very odd case that, like I said, you have three deaths and two people separately being charged with their death.
Yeah, absolutely. And just going off of that, the wrong way crash driver, that being Thomas Petrie, he pleaded guilty, was sentenced to 37 years. But like you had mentioned, I think what makes this case so unique and what makes it stand out is because the other driver, too, Devin Perkins, also arrested because he was driving more than 100 miles per hour when his girlfriend and his friends were killed. So I want to ask you, are you surprised authorities arrested him and even more so that a jury found him guilty?
Not really, because nowadays people are just getting more into the fact of you have to be accountable for your actions, and more of these cases that me and you have even done, and other cases that are out there. That message is getting out there that you just can't get away with things anymore, and you have to be held accountable for your actions, even if it's being at a bar and driving recklessly and all that. That all leads to the death of these three people. Yes, the individual driving the other car drunk on the other side of the road, is the horrible part of this. But then you have this driver with the inability to notice it, to get out of the way. His reflexes or reactions are slow. So that leads to the prosecution of him. And I kind of agree with it.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because I know the family on the other side feels the opposite. And now Devin Perkins, come his sentencing in early March, is facing a minimum of 30 years in prison, again, despite the family seemingly not even wanting him to go to jail. Do you think that come sentencing, a judge will take that into consideration and it's possible that he may even avoid jail time? Or do you think that he'll ultimately be sentenced to prison?
Well, that's why, we have the criminal justice system, and the judge is going to make that determination. And he's going to listen to the families, read their statements and see their emotions when it comes to this. And the judge is going to make the right decision in this. And here's the interesting part of this: it could be anything, like you just said. There's no line in this. It's a unique case. And when you have someone else who's already pled guilty to these deaths, that may play a big part in it. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the judge weighs this, what he takes into consideration, and then ultimately what the sentence is.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk to me a little bit about what it's like working a crash scene, especially something of this magnitude.
Yeah, they're difficult, especially when you have, three young deaths that are the cause of this. You get into, you kind of work backwards. Where were they coming from? Where were they doing? And then you have the roadside tests of possible DWIs, and accident investigation scenes in the NYPD were handled by the highway unit. So they were experts at tire marks and skid marks and rate of speed of cars, and all that leads into this investigation. And then you get into the backgrounds of where they were and what they were doing leading up to this crash, with, again, with the accident scene all culminates into one big case, and then the determinations are made about who may be arrested.
Yeah, and it seems like a very kind of integral part, and especially kind of very complex too, given that it may appear one way at first and then it turns out to be something completely different, or there's just another added layer to something like this. What do you make of the state's argument in this case about Devin Perkins? So he was obviously driving 100 miles per hour at the time of the crash. We all know that at this point, but that they focused on that during trial. Again, even though you have this whole other aspect of the driver driving the wrong way and then even fleeing the scene afterwards. What do you kind of make of just both behaviors on both sides?
Yeah, well, like I said, that's why investigations are done, and actions are accountable. You're accountable for your actions. Driving 100 miles an hour, whether you're impaired or not, is difficult to determine. Rate of speeds of other cars, depth perception, all of that. So your reflexes and reactions are going to be much slower, when you are faced with a challenge of another car coming at you. And when you're going 100 miles an hour, you're not going to get out of the way because you have to take into account the speed of the other car as well. And those two close a gap very, very quickly, and more quickly than you think. And if you're impaired in any way or driving that speed, you're not going to be able to react the right way. And that's what happened here. And that's what I mean by being held by, your actions.
Yeah, and again, it's just heartbreaking overall. Three young people lost their lives. Devin Perkins' girlfriend, Allie Spice, was killed in this accident. Two of his friends were killed as well too. And now it appears that two people might be going to jail for a very long time because of this. Tom Smith, I want to thank you so much for your insight into this case. Before we sign you off, though, what are you expecting that will happen at sentencing next month?
Well, that's going to be it's going to be a tuned in thing to really see what the statements are, how they're received by the court and the judge, and then what he takes into account with the driver's background, with his remorsefulness, with all of that. All of that leads into judges' decisions when it comes to sentencing. So this will be very, very interesting to see how this goes.
I agree. It'll be very interesting to see how this all continues to play out. Tom Smith, again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure, Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
I'm also joined now by criminal defense attorney Safa Robinson Ferreira to get her take on this case. Safa, it's always great to see you. First I have to ask you, are you surprised that Devin Perkins was convicted so quickly by a jury and is facing 30 years in prison for this fatal crash, despite some of the victim's family members opposing him going to prison?
I'm not surprised, not one bit, and I will say, that ultimately, although the victim's family members did not want executed, the case caption is the people of the state of Florida versus Devin Perkins. It's not these specific family or these familial individuals going against this individual. It's the state, it's the government that's bringing about these charges. I'm not surprised that he was convicted at all. The allegations here are that he operated his motor vehicle at an extremely high rate of speed. And although there was another vehicle involved, that ultimately that person was convicted or pled guilty to certain charges, it does not absolve Mr. Perkins of his liability and responsibility to ensure that he's operating his motor vehicle as a reasonable and prudent driver, and ultimately operating his motor vehicle in a way that ensures the safety of himself and his passengers. So not a surprise here that there was a conviction. With any case where there's the loss of life, oftentimes those cases or those charges and convictions carry hefty penalties. So it's also not surprising here that he's looking at an upward of 30 years in prison at a minimum.
Have you ever seen a case like this before where there is someone who seemingly at first can appear completely at fault, right? You have someone who's driving the wrong way down a highway, comes head on into the passengers, killing all of them, flees the scene. But then in this case, the outlier being that Devin Perkins is also arrested for driving more than 100 miles per hour after state troopers also say he was allegedly under the influence. Have you ever seen something like this before?
It actually happens all the time. A lot of times what happens is, of course, we have a scenario where an individual is arrested and charged, with a particular crime, especially when whatever that crime is results in the death of a person. But and that's what we hear in the news, that's what we hear in the media. But then what oftentimes happens is component to this that actually pulls responsibility to some other party, and they are ultimately charged as well. And that's why we ultimately end up at trials, right? So, when there's a question of fact, when there's a question of who is actually responsible, or if one particular individual is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt for these alleged acts, oftentimes what happens is there's a back and forth between whether or not that person is fully responsible. What would they have been responsible for? What does the evidence show and prove? And then oftentimes what happens is you have another individual who, if they would have done something or refrained from doing something, then it may have changed the outcome to some extent. And so now we often see that there's another individual that's charged, just like this case, and both are facing charges. Both, may go to trial, may not. I think in these particular cases, both parties did, and they were ultimately convicted because there was a finding of responsibility on both sides of this. Especially when you have drunk driving cases, or cases where somebody's operating at a high rate of speed, reckless conduct, and things like that. You do see this from time to time.
And it's interesting too, kind of seeing the support that Devin has, not even just from the victims' families, but also there's a website dedicated to saving him from going to prison. And a lot of people, I guess their critique of this entire case is that he should have just been given a speeding ticket instead. What do you make of kind of that criticism that he was taken to trial and that he was ultimately convicted?
At the end of the day, again, we have a situation here where his conduct was alleged to be reckless, driving at 100 miles per hour. I'm not sure what the speed limit was where he was driving, but driving 100 miles per hour presumably is reckless conduct. And ultimately, for instance, if we play the scenario where there was this other car that was driving, that person may have been intoxicated. Had Mr. Perkins not been operating at such a high rate of speed, would he have been able to avoid a collision with that vehicle? Again, when we're talking about drunk driving cases and the ability for that driver to be able to operate that motor vehicle as a reasonable driver, as a prudent driver, as someone is aware of what's going on the road and being able to navigate or maneuver their vehicle in a defensive manner so to ensure that collisions don't happen, that really isn't here. We have the allegation of intoxication with regard to Mr. Perkins, and that does impair the faculties that a person generally would have when operating a motor vehicle, when making certain decisions. And so I don't think that this was unfair to charge him. I think that the government essentially is following suit. If you're 21, whether you're 55, if you drink and you drive and you cause the death of a person, the government's going to charge you. It's unfortunate that this was a situation where his friends ultimately passed away because of it. But again, had he not been intoxicated, and operating at a high rate of speed, would there be a different outcome? And there's a very good possibility that there would have been. I think that the families are finding solidarity in knowing that, he lost the lives of three of his friends, including one of them being his girlfriend. But again, it does not remove the criminal responsibility, unfortunately.
Come sentencing, do you think that the judge will throw the book at Devin or give him some type of leniency given that the families don't want him to go to prison?
It's ultimately going to be up to the judge, and the judge is going to consider what these family members have to say. One of the things that's a part of sentencing in most states, it's that way here in New York, and I'm sure it's the same in Florida, is that the victims of the crime or the family members of the victims are able to give what we call victim impact statements. And in those victim impact statements, as they're read out loud to the court during sentencing, those family members can ask for leniency. They can talk about forgiveness. They can talk about the fact that he lost his best friends, his girlfriend, and things of that nature, and ask for the judge to grant leniency because they've forgiven him, and they don't want to see him spend the next 30 years of his life in prison. So they can certainly do that. Ultimately, like I said, it would be up to the judge. I don't know too much about this judge, but we can have a no nonsense, no tolerance judge. If we've got a judge who he himself or she herself has lost a family member or loved one to a violent crash or DWIs, or they have a tougher stance on drinking and driving offenses, then there is a good possibility that they may throw the book at him. Again, we're dealing with the loss of not one life, but three. And I understand that this is a young man, and hopefully at some point he's able to turn his life around. But it's going to be up to the judge and whatever view the judge brings to this situation. I know that they're going to be trying to go forward with what we call a downward departure for his sentence, which essentially means undercutting the minimum sentence required and getting a lower type of sentence, which could be probation, could be less than the 30 years. But again, that's ultimately going to be up for the judge to decide.
And then, of course, we can't talk about this case without talking about the other driver and his role in this entire crash as well, too. But what is your opinion on the other driver, Thomas Petrie? He was going the wrong way. He fled the scene, didn't call 911. What do you make of all of that? And then he ultimately was sentenced to 37 years in prison.
Absolutely, and he faces obviously some level of responsibility in this crash, operating a motor vehicle in an intoxicated fashion and driving the wrong way down this particular road. Again, but for this person being intoxicated, would he have driven down the wrong way of a road? Would his mental faculties have been intact enough that this could have all been avoided? And so the jury did find him guilty. He was sentenced to 37 years, which again reflects the contributory factor of his actions with the loss of these 3 lives as well. And so the judge may ultimately sentence them in line and go with that 30 sentence minimum for Mr. Perkins. But ultimately, this other individual, yes, was charged, was convicted because of his responsibility as well. Not only that, but we've got the factor that he left the scene, did not call 911. If this person would have called 911, could it have saved some of the lives of the individuals in the car? And when you flee, we in the law call that consciousness of guilt. And so basically the fact that he removed himself from the scene, hid, ran, goes to show that he knew that he had done something wrong or that he had committed a crime and was trying to avoid the consequences of that.
Absolutely. And just, we cover a lot of horrible cases here, and this one is no exception to that. It's just horrible, all the losses of life, given if some different decisions were made, we might have had a different outcome and probably not been talking about this right now. Safa, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight, but I do have one final question for you. Come March 3rd, what are you expecting out of sentencing for Devin Perkins?
For Mr. Perkins, I'm going to expect that he's going to be sentenced to the minimum. I think he's going to be sentenced to that 30 years. I think the judge will take into consideration what the family members have to say, but he has to apply the law as it's written, or he or she has to apply the law as it's written. He or she will take those factors into consideration, but I think more than likely the judge is going to come in line with that 30-year sentence, similar to what the other counterpart received as well.
And we'll continue to follow that. I can't even imagine what that day will look like. I can only imagine that it'll just be very heart-wrenching, very emotional, especially for the victims' families. Safa, again, thank you so much for your time and your insight into this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Devin Perkins is set to be sentenced on March 3rd. He faces anywhere between 30 years up to life in prison. And for now, he remains in the Volusia County Branch Jail awaiting sentencing. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.